The four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all claim to either have been eyewitnesses of the events that they are recording or to have been interviewing eyewitnesses of these events to get their information. However, it doesn't seem that we can know if this is true or not unless we know who wrote the Gospels in the first place. So scholars have looked into this question of who wrote the Gospels from both internal and external evidence outside and inside of the Gospels themselves. And so New Testament scholar Jacob Vernement, who lived a long time ago, notes that the simple style of writing in the Gospels is what we would expect for the traditional authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so he's saying that there's nothing out of the ordinary where it can't be them off the bat. And then additionally, a little bit more modern scholar, Michael J. Wilkins, notes that the true identities of the four Gospels were never in question historically. From the very earliest eyewitnesses, we find the authors' names associated with each gospel. So he's saying that these weren't authors that were later attributed to the writings hundreds of years later. From the first records that we have of these writings, we have these four names associated with them. And so additionally, Dr. William Lane Craig notes in his work Reasonable Faith that the authors of the Gospels appear to have been first century Jews who were witnesses of these events. And so if the Gospel was actually written by the traditional authors, then the accounts that they're recording are either blatant lies, meaning that they knew the information was false and they were making it up to trick people or for some other reason, or at a minimum, it was something that they believed to be historically accurate and that they were trying their best to record, which is possible if they were actual eyewitnesses of these events. And so the first Gospel, Matthew, was written by the disciple Matthew, who was also called Levi, and he was a tax collector, one of the earliest 12 disciples of Jesus. And so all the early church fathers attribute the Gospel of Matthew to the disciple Matthew, including Papias, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, and Origen. And so some people try to push back against this by saying that Matthew, since he was one of the 12 original disciples of Jesus, would not have relied so heavily on Mark, and so they say that it's unlikely that Matthew would have used Mark since he was first-hand eyewitnesses of the events, and Mark was a disciple of Peter, as we'll see later, and was getting the information from someone else and writing it down and wasn't a first-hand eyewitness. But the thing about this is that Mark was the earliest gospel, and since Mark was an interpreter of Peter, who was also one of the 12 disciples walking around with Matthew and living life with Jesus himself, it doesn't seem like Matthew would have had a problem to use Mark as a source, since his came before him, and to supplement in a way Mark's writings that came before him. So moving on to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, there is no external evidence for another author of the Gospel of Mark other than Mark, who was an interpreter of the disciple Peter. And so the church father Papias wrote that Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. And so Mark is also confirmed to be the author of the gospel that bears his name by other sources such as the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, Irenaeus in his work against heresies, Clement of Alexandria. And so there's just, again, unanimous record of Mark being the author of Mark by the early church fathers who were closest to these writings, though probably didn't know these people directly since their works were passed down through generation to generation. The earliest disciples of Christianity probably knew them who were walking around, but not these church fathers because they came a few hundred years later. And so moving on to the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is attributed to Luke, who is a traveling companion of Paul and was a physician by trade. And so an expert on Luke, Dr. Darrell Bach, wrote that, naming Luke as the author, notes that this memoir of Jesus was written by a follower of the apostles. Allusions to Luke's gospel appear as early as 1 or 2 Clement in 95 and 100 AD. The Muratorian canon also attributes the gospel to Luke, who was a doctor. Irenaeus, in his work against heresies, also tries ties the gospel to Luke, a follower of Paul, and notes the evidence of the we sections that are used in Acts as pointing to someone who knew Paul. And so Darabont continues and says that Tertullian, in his work against Marcion, calls Luke's gospel a digest of Paul's gospel. Eusebius notes that Luke is a native of Antioch. What makes this evidence impressive is the largest list of possible companions of Paul who might have fitted in the blank of the we sections had the author not been known. The unanimity of the tradition on authorship of it being Luke is important. And so the Gospel of Luke is the first half of a two-part work that was Luke Acts. And in our Bible, they're separated by the Gospel of John, just because that's how the church later decided to organize our Bibles. But they're a two-part work written by the same person who we know historically to be Luke. But even if it somehow wasn't attributed to Luke by the early church fathers, which it was, but I'm just saying hypothetically, if that didn't happen, then these two works still were written by the same person, and they're both addressed to the same person as being his audience. And so that's what he's saying here, is that both of these were written by Luke, who was a physician. And so, moving on to the Gospel of John, New Testament scholar Greg Blombert notes that every piece of ancient external evidence, save one, agrees that the author was the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. No Orthodox writer ever proposes any other alternative for the author of the fourth Gospel, and the book is accepted in all of the early canonical list, which is all the more significant given the frequency of heterodox misinterpretation of it. It is not until the early 4th century, in the writings of Eusebius, a church historian, that any ambiguity appears. And so, I wanted to look into this a little bit more because I was curious where this one reference was that doesn't attribute it to John. I was curious who else does it attribute to. And so I did a little bit of research, and according to Eusebius, Papias, who is the source that Eusebius used to get his information, he's just getting the information from him and writing it down. So Papias claims that there were two men named John ministering in Ephesus at the time, which is where the Gospel of John was believed to be written, and both these guys' first name is John. So either way, even if there is a discrepancy, it still was written by John, it just could have been a different John. So it's not like, oh no, the Gospel of John, we'll know who wrote it. It was written by a guy named John, we're just not sure if it's John the Apostle or John the Elder. And so, kind of going off of this, my research I looked into said that some have suggested that this other John wrote the Gospel, but Papias' actual words leave room for interpretation, and Eusebius may have wrongly interpreted what Papias himself meant. So it's kind of like we don't really know which one that the earliest source we have was talking about, but it most likely means John the Apostle. And so Papias mentions John the Apostle and John the Elder, both of which could refer to John the Apostle, because elder and apostle are interchangeable words. According to Papias's words, all of the apostles were elders, so John the Elder can easily be John the Apostle. So, however, Eusebius still considered this work to be one of the four canonical Gospels, and even called it the Holy Four Gospels. So he still believed the Gospel of John to be canonical, and needed to be in the Bible. He just said it could have been John the Elder, it could have been John the Apostle, but we're not sure. And personally, I think since all the other church fathers attribute it to John the son of Zebedee, and John the son of Zebedee also lines up with what Papias is saying, I think it's definitely very reasonable to think that it was written by John, the son of Zebedee, because that's what most of the sources list, and even the one in question says that's a possibility, but it could have been the other one. So basically it was written by a guy named John, most likely the son of Zebedee, but one source says it could have been John the Elder, who was a different John, but I think that's unlikely. And so Darabont, again, who we heard from earlier, also talks about this, and he kind of summarizes that the well-known argument from internal evidence seeks to identify the author, working into increasingly narrow points of identification, just from reading through the Gospel of John. The author was a Jew of Palestine, and an eyewitness of what he observes, an apostle, and his name was John. The linking of this argument with the statements beloved disciple, commonly referred to in the Gospel of John, is key, and it shows up in Irenaeus' remark about then one who leaned on Jesus' breast, and that person is referenced to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so the best candidate for this identification is John, the son of Zebedee, especially given the frequent pairing of John and Peter in the synoptics, and the beloved disciple and Peter in the fourth gospel. And so the Gospels are full of names, dates, historical events, cultural details, customs, and cultural opinions. Dr. William Lane Craig, again, also notes that the style of each particular Gospel is appropriate to what we know of the personalities of the traditional authors. So this isn't hard evidence that this is for sure who wrote it, because we can't look at the Gospels themselves and say, oh yes, this is the writing style of this person, because we just don't have that information. But it's not a writing style that you wouldn't expect from that person. And so I thought it was interesting that it seems like it would have been difficult for the Gospels looked together to have such an harmonized view of Jesus if they were forged and later falsely attributed to these traditional authors. And so there are some apparent discrepancies in the Gospel if you just read them at face value, where it looks like, this seems to kind of contradict and be a little bit different than this other version of the same exact story. But the thing is, if you look into it more deeply, you can go and see that these different accounts actually complement each other and provide additional details that are not recorded in the other Gospels to give more details, because they were eyewitnesses of the events. And J. Warner Wallace even mentions this, and he talks about how when he's interviewing people as a detective, he doesn't expect their stories to be the exact same when he interviews multiple eyewitnesses of one crime scene. He says he expects them to be different because we all have different perspectives, people are standing in different areas, people have different backgrounds growing up, that'll make them more prone to remember certain things and not remember other things, and to think that some details are more important, whereas another person may not see that detail as important. And so it seems that in the Gospels this is also happening. It's not evidence that they colluded and made it up later on together. It's actually evidence that they really were there witnessing these events just from different perspectives. And so these existence of the apparent contradictions, if the Gospels were forged later and written down to create one story about Jesus and to fake it like it was 4 different eyewitnesses, then they do a really poor job of that. They wouldn't have come up with these different apparent discrepancies that you have to work to understand. They would just make it easy and make it all the same because they didn't want to have anything questionable. So that's evidence that these accounts really were written by the eyewitnesses that they are attributed to. And so something else that's interesting is if the church made up these stories and then wanted to attribute them to a person who really didn't write them, then these are not the people that it seems likely they would have picked. And if we look at church history, Peter was the founder of the Christian church in Jerusalem. And it's written in the Gospels, even Jesus talks to Peter and says, on this rock, Peter meant rock in that language. And so he's making a pun there. He's saying, based on what you have said about me being a disciple, that's what I'm going to build my church on. And so this was a big thing, and Peter ended up becoming the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So if the church wanted to make up a name for a person who wrote this, they would have never picked Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They would have picked Peter, because Peter had a lot of status in the early church. And so this happened, actually, and these are called the pseudepigraphal Gospels. There's a Gospel of Mary, there's a Gospel of Peter, who we can look at and we can say this describes a different Jesus than what the 4 Gospels describe. And so that's how the early church knew that these weren't forged Gospels. They looked at them and they said, we know who wrote these. They're unanimously attributed to these 4 people who were eyewitnesses of the events or got their information from eyewitnesses of these events. And that's how come we know that they're reliable. They don't contradict each other, they complement each other. So it creates a really strong case for the reliability of the Gospels and for there being the traditional authorship. So we've gone through a lot of information about who wrote the Gospels, but let's say that somehow I'm wrong and that the historians are wrong and we just straight up don't have any idea who wrote the 4 Gospels. Okay, well, we still have good reasons to believe in the traditional authors, even if we don't know for sure who wrote them. There's not a lot of things that I know for sure in the world. There's always a bit of doubt. I could have remembered something wrong, saw something wrong. It's happened before. But the thing is, we have reasonable evidence to believe that the traditional 4 Gospels were written by the traditional 4 authors. And even if they weren't, even if we were completely wrong, then we still have good reason to believe that they are at least trying to tell the truth about the events that they're recording. And so if you want to, you can watch this other video I made talking about how we know that the Gospels were at least trying to tell us the truth. It doesn't show that they were for sure telling us the truth, but at least that they were trying, and that's a start for figuring out if they were telling us the truth or not. So if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more content that spreads God's love through apologetics.